Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm your host here in Info Express, and this is your weekly source for everything happening in US-Canada migration and border policy. Every week, we break down the most important immigration news, policy changes, and trends affecting millions of people who live, work, or travel between these two countries. Whether you're planning to immigrate, you're already living as an expat, you're a policy enthusiast, or you're just trying to understand what's really happening at the border, this channel is for you. Today, we have some absolutely crucial updates that could change everything you thought you knew about the US-Canada border. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Before we dive in, let me throw some numbers at you that might blow your mind. What if I told you that Canada just implemented changes that resulted in an 86% overnight drop in a controversial border practice that was overwhelming border agents, or that illegal border crossings plummeted by 89% in just 6 months? Here's another one: over 126,000 Canadians packed up and moved to the United States in a single year. That's more than the population of cities like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California. These aren't just statistics, these are real people, real families, and real changes that are reshaping the relationship between two of the world's closest allies. Some of these policies are working better than anyone expected, while others are raising serious questions about what comes next. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what it could mean for anyone thinking about crossing that border. So let's break it all down, piece by piece. Part 1. Canada's massive $1.3 billion border investment. Let's start with the headline that should be making waves everywhere. Canada has announced a $1.3 billion investment in border security. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's a lot of money. And you're absolutely right. So where is all this money going? This isn't just about hiring more border agents, although that's part of it. We're talking about a complete technological transformation of how Canada monitors and secures its border with the United States. First up, 60 brand new surveillance drones. These aren't your hobby drones. These are advanced systems capable of monitoring vast stretches of remote border territory that would be nearly impossible to patrol on foot or by vehicle. The US-Canada border is the longest international border in the world at nearly 5,525 miles, and much of it runs through wilderness, mountains, and areas where traditional surveillance is extremely difficult. But it's not just drones. Canada is also installing new surveillance towers equipped with advanced cameras and sensors. Think of these as high-tech watchtowers that can detect movement, heat signatures, and suspicious activity 24/7 in any weather conditions. And then there's the scanning technology. We're talking about X-ray machines and chemical analyzers that can detect contraband, drugs, weapons, and other prohibited items with unprecedented accuracy. This is CSI-level technology being deployed at scale. The message here is clear. Canada is taking border security seriously, and they're backing it up with serious investment, but technology alone doesn't tell the whole story. Let's look at what prompted all of this. Part 2. The flagpoling ban, a game changer. Now let's talk about something called flagpoling. If you've never heard this term, you're not alone. It's one of those immigration practices that most people don't know about unless they're directly involved in the system. Here's how flagpoling worked. Imagine you're in Canada on a work permit or study permit, and you need to change your immigration status. Maybe you got a new job offer, maybe you want to extend your stay, or maybe you're applying for permanent residence. Instead of waiting weeks or months for an appointment at an immigration office, some people discovered a shortcut. They would drive to the US border, tell the US border agent, "I'm just flagpoling," briefly enter US territory, or just touch the border, and then immediately turn around and come back into Canada. This would trigger an immediate immigration review at the Canadian border post, allowing them to get their status changed on the spot. Sounds convenient, right? Well, here's the problem. This was creating absolute chaos at border crossings. US Customs and Border Protection agents had to process thousands of people who weren't actually trying to enter the United States. They were just using the US border as a bureaucratic loophole. It was tying up resources, creating long wait times for legitimate travelers, and causing frustration on both sides. So on December 24, 2024, yes, Christmas Eve, Canada ended the practice. Just like that, flagpoling was banned. The results were immediate and dramatic, an 86% decrease in this activity practically overnight. We're talking about thousands of workdays saved for U.S. border agents who can now focus on actual border security instead of processing people who are essentially just doing paperwork. This is one of those rare policy changes where you can immediately see it working. But it also raises questions. What happens to people who need to change their status quickly? Are there alternative systems in place? These are conversations that are still ongoing. Now we get to some really striking statistics. Between June and December of 2024, just a 6-month period, illegal U.S. crossings by foreign nationals into Canada dropped by 89%. Let me say that again, 89%. That's not a gradual decline, that's a collapse. So, what happened? Canada implemented a much stricter approach to visitor visa applications, particularly from what they identified as high-risk countries. Now, I know that phrase might make some people uncomfortable, and it certainly sparked debate, but the policy is based on data about which countries have the highest rates of visa overstays, asylum claims, or other immigration violations. The results of this stricter screening? Visa refusals from these high-risk countries jumped by 61%. That means roughly 6 out of every 10 additional applicants who might have gotten a visa before are now being denied. And here's another connected statistic. Asylum claims by people who entered Canada on visitor visas dropped by 18%. This suggests that some people were obtaining visitor visas with the intention of claiming asylum once they arrived. And the stricter screening is catching more of these cases up front. Now, this is where we need to pause and think critically. On one hand, these numbers suggest the policy is achieving its stated goal of reducing irregular migration. On the other hand, critics argue that legitimate travelers, refugees fleeing genuine danger, and people with valid reasons to visit Canada are getting caught up in this stricter system. There's also a humanitarian question here. If people are genuinely fleeing persecution or danger, and they're being denied legitimate pathways to protection, where do they go? What happens to them? These are complex questions without easy answers, and they're part of why immigration policy is so contentious. But the numbers clearly show that Canada's approach is having a major impact. Let's talk about one of the most controversial and effective border policies in recent years, the expansion of the Safe Third Country Agreement. First, some background. The Safe Third Country Agreement is a treaty between the US and Canada that says if you arrive in one country first, you have to claim asylum there. You can't skip to the other country to claim asylum instead. The logic is that both countries are safe democracies with robust asylum systems, so there's no reason to asylum shop. Originally, this agreement only applied at official border crossings. So here's what was happening. People would enter the United States, travel north, and then cross into Canada illegally between official border posts. Once in Canada, they would claim asylum. Because they didn't present themselves at an official crossing, the Safe Third Country Agreement didn't apply. This created a huge problem, particularly at a place called Roxham Road, an unofficial crossing point in Quebec that became famous, or maybe even infamous, as the main route for irregular asylum seekers. At its peak, hundreds of people per day were crossing at Roxham Road alone. In March 2023, Canada and the United States expanded the Safe Third Country Agreement to cover the entire land border, not just official crossings. This closed the loophole. The impact was dramatic and immediate. Before the expansion, Canada was seeing an average of 165 asylum seekers per day crossing irregularly. After the expansion, just 12 per day. That's a 93% reduction. Roxham Road, which had become a symbol of irregular migration, essentially shut down as a crossing point. The RCMP, who had been managing the steady flow of asylum seekers there, could redeploy to other duties. Again, this raises important questions. Supporters say this brought order to the asylum system and ensured people follow proper legal channels. Critics argue that it's making it harder for genuine refugees to access protection and that people aren't just disappearing. They're either staying in the US with uncertain status, attempting more dangerous crossing points, or being sent back to potentially dangerous situations. So far, we've talked a lot about people trying to enter Canada, but there's a massive trend going in the opposite direction that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Canadians are leaving for the United States in record numbers. In 2022 alone, 126,340 Canadians moved to the United States. To put that in perspective, that's a 70% increase compared to just 10 years earlier. That's not a small uptick, that's a fundamental shift in migration patterns. So why are so many Canadians heading south? Well, there are several factors at play. First, there's the economic reality. The United States generally offers higher salaries, particularly in fields like technology, finance, healthcare, and engineering. A software engineer in Silicon Valley or Seattle can often earn significantly more than they would in Toronto or Vancouver, even accounting for cost of living differences. Second, there's the tax situation. While this varies by state and province, many US states have lower overall tax burdens than Canadian provinces, meaning professionals can keep more of what they earn. Third, there's the weather. Yes, I know it sounds superficial, but for many Canadians tired of brutal winters, the appeal of living in California, Texas, Florida, or other warm weather states is very real. Fourth, there's career advancement. For people in certain industries, particularly entertainment, tech, and finance, the United States simply has more opportunities, bigger companies, and more room for career growth. And finally, there's the brain drain effect. Once a critical mass of talented Canadians move to certain US cities or industries, it creates networks and opportunities that attract even more Canadians. This is a concern for Canada because many of the people leaving are exactly the highly educated, highly skilled professionals that every developed country wants to attract and retain. We're talking about doctors, engineers, researchers, tech workers, and entrepreneurs. But here's an interesting counterpoint. Between 2010 and 2019, the number of US non-citizen residents moving to Canada increased fourfold, from 2,100 to over 9,000 per year. So while the overall numbers are much smaller, there's also a growing trend of Americans moving north. Americans move to Canada for various reasons: universal healthcare, political climate, perceptions of safety, quality of life in Canadian cities, or career opportunities in specific industries where Canada is strong, like AI research or natural resources. So we have migration flowing in both directions, but at very different scales and for very different reasons. Taking all of this together, what we're seeing is a fundamental reshaping of the US-Canada relationship on migration issues. Both countries are investing heavily in border security and enforcement. Both are trying to reduce irregular migration while maintaining the flow of legitimate travel, trade, and immigration that both economies depend on. The US-Canada border is unique in the world. These are two wealthy democracies with deeply integrated economies, extensive people-to-people ties, and a shared language and culture. The border has historically been relatively open and easy to cross compared to most international borders. But that's changing. The policies we've discussed today, the flagpoling ban, stricter visa screening, the expanded Safe Third Country Agreement, the massive investment in surveillance technology, these all represent a move toward a more controlled, more monitored, more restrictive border. The question is whether this strikes the right balance. Is it possible to maintain security without sacrificing the openness that has made the US-Canada relationship special? Can both countries enforce their immigration laws effectively while still providing protection to genuine refugees and asylum seekers? And what about the long-term economic implications? If talented Canadians continue moving south in large numbers, what does that mean for Canada's economy and competitiveness? Conversely, if the border becomes too difficult to cross, what impact does that have on business travel, tourism, and the millions of families with relatives on both sides of the border? These are the questions that policymakers on both sides are grappling with right now. All right, I want to hear from you. This is where the conversation really gets interesting, because everyone has a different perspective based on their own experiences and values. Here are some questions for you. Do you think Canada's stricter border policies are justified? Are they effectively managing migration, or are they going too far and potentially harming people who need protection? What about the flagpoling ban? Was this a necessary step to restore order at the border? Or should there be better alternatives for people who need to change their immigration status quickly? And here's a big one. If you're Canadian, would you consider moving to the United States for better career opportunities? Or if you're American, What would it take for you to consider moving to Canada? Drop your thoughts, experiences, and opinions in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I genuinely love hearing different perspectives. Some of the best discussions happen in the comments section of these videos, so don't hold back. If you found this deep dive valuable, and you want to stay informed about US-Canada migration news, please hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these videos to more people who are interested in this topic. And if you're not already subscribed, click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We cover migration news every single week, and immigration policy changes fast. I'll make sure you're always ahead of the curve with clear, detailed breakdowns like this one. Finally, if you think someone else would benefit from this information, maybe a friend who's thinking about immigrating, a family member who follows policy issues, or a colleague who works in immigration, please share this video with them. Immigration affects millions of people, and the more informed we all are, the better conversations we can have about these important issues. That wraps up this week's US-Canada migration news update. We covered a lot of ground today. Canada's massive $1.3 billion border security investment, the flagpoling ban that changed everything overnight, the dramatic 89% drop in illegal crossings, the safe, third country agreement that reduced irregular asylum claims by 93%, and the surprising trend of over 126,000 Canadians moving south to the United States. The US-Canada border is evolving rapidly, and what we're seeing is a shift toward more controlled, more monitored, and more technology-driven border management. Whether this is good policy or problematic enforcement depends a lot on your perspective and values. What's clear is that these changes are having real impacts on real people: immigrants, refugees, expats, border workers, and millions of travelers who cross this border every year. I'll be here every week, bringing you the latest developments, breaking down complex policies, and helping make sense of what's happening. Immigration policy can seem overwhelming and confusing, but when we break it down and look at the evidence, it becomes much more understandable. Thank you so much for watching, for engaging, and for being part of this community. I'll see you next week with another update. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and take care.